The comment is the following. Glenn is an eminently reasonable person. It's always good to preface paragraphs of criticism by that kind of a preface. And so I am left puzzled by the following. Remember early on when everyone to the left of the center was talking about the all-important, quote, context? My puzzlement, Glenn fails to mention at all the context in which the fighting in Gaza is occurring. That is, Hamas is actively fighting the IDF in civilian areas behind and under civilians. As long as that is the case, Israel will continue to prosecute the war that was declared on them on October 7th, and civilians will continue to die. All right, I'm just going to stop there. And already there's a premise, a fundamental premise that with which I vehemently disagree, and it alters everything else that follows from that, which is just like I think it is incredibly ahistorical and distorted to believe that the war between Ukraine and Russia began on February 22nd, 2022, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, February 24th, because it was preceded by 8 years of a civil war between Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine and a coup government that the United States helped to install after it overthrew the democratically elected government in 2014, and the expansion of NATO, and all that came before that. So if you want to pretend that the war began with the Russian invasion and nothing else before that counts as part of the conflict, then of course you're going to say Russia was 100% to blame, and Russia invaded Ukraine in an unprovoked manner. Out of nowhere, everything was so peaceful, so perfect, everybody was happy, and then suddenly the Russians out of nowhere invaded. Then you're going to conclude that it was all the Russians' fault if you actually want to begin history on February 24th, 2022. That's not when the actual history of the conflict begins. The history of the conflict begins years earlier, which is why it's far more ambiguous about who provoked that war and who started that war and what was the cause of it. Things that we've gone over at great length on this show, in which most people on the right who support Israel are supportive of. That idea that you have to look at events prior to February 24th, 2022 to understand the war. The idea that the war between the Palestinians and the Israelis began on October 7, 2023 is even more preposterous. There was no peace between Israel and Palestine prior to October 7th. Gaza is a strip of 2.2 million people that Israel has been blockading. Israel controlled the airspace and bombed the airport. There was one airport in Gaza City. Israel bombed it, bombed the only runway, and said, if you try and rebuild it, we're going to bomb it again. So nobody can leave by air. Israel controls the sea lanes, so no one can leave by boat. If people try to leave by boat, the Israeli Navy murders them. The borders of Gaza are completely closed off, almost entirely by Israel, and then also by the US-backed dictator of Egypt. Remember that in 2013, the Egyptians had their first ever democratic election after they overthrew the other US-supported dictator, Hosni Mubarak. And unfortunately for the Egyptians, they elected the wrong person, Mohamed Morsi, who the United States did not want in power. And so there was a military coup led by General Sisi and backed by John Kerry and the State Department and the Obama administration that they praised as an advancement of democracy. And the General Sisi took over and began governing Egypt as a military dictator who continues to rule to this day with $1 billion or more given every year by the United States to do the bidding of the United States, which is why Egypt keeps that border with Gaza closed as well, in part as well because Egypt doesn't want people from Gaza being able to enter Egypt because they're not Egyptian, they're Palestinians, and Gaza is their land. So they can't leave by land either. So what does that mean for 2.2 million people not to be able to leave by land, by sea, or by air? It means that they live in an open-air prison. It's not a metaphor, it's not a simile, it's not a symbol, it's a literal description of the lives of the people of Gaza. At the same time, you have aggressive, massive settlements being built more so than ever all throughout the West Bank in a way that completely prohibits any possibility of Palestinian statehood, which means the Palestinians will live indefinitely under the occupying rule of a foreign country, an occupation that the entire world considers illegal, that is illegal under UN resolutions, that the Israelis ignore and continue to expand in the most brutal and humiliating ways. There is no group of people, none, that would accept rule by a foreign military that deprives them of every conceivable right imaginable. You have 20% of Israel that is composed of Israeli Arabs, and maybe you can analogize their situation to, say, Jim Crow in the 1940s. But as far as the Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, they have absolutely no rights of any kind. Their entire lives are controlled of and deprived by Israel. This is not the first time Israel has bombed Gaza. It has bombed Gaza continuously. In 2014 and 2018, the Palestinians in Gaza tried protesting non-violently, including with symbolic marches to the fence to look at the land that they used to occupy. And then in 2018, the Israelis decided to start shooting them. So they protested non-violently at the fence. The Israelis were shooting their kneecap and then killed over 200 people. So this is a population that has been brutalized and repressed on every level. So the idea that everything was peaceful and wonderful and the history of the Israeli-Gazan war began only on October 7th when Hamas killed several hundred Israeli civilians, which turned out to be the actual number. It wasn't 1,200 civilians or 1,400 people killed. That number was reduced to 1,200 and then to 1,000. A lot of them were members of the armed services, the armed forces, the IDF, the various police forces that responded. So there were a lot of civilians brutalized and killed. It was a horrible attack. At the same time, it was part of a war that has been going on for decades that did not start on October 7th. Israel is a country that the United States has been funding and arming for decades now. And the United States is as responsible as is Israel for the denial of any kind of dignity of the Palestinian people. So you can call me reasonable and then say that I don't put things in context, but I've actually talked about that context many times. And actually, beginning on October 7th, the first show that we did after October 7th was October 9th. It was that Monday that happened on Saturday, October 7th. We were on the air Monday. And I devoted, 70% of that show to arguing at great length, not with lip service, not as a passing comment, to constructing an argument as to why the attack on October 7th by Hamas could not be justified in any way, legally, ethically, or morally, independent of what your view is of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I condemn that attack many, many times. There's nobody 5 months into this war who doesn't understand the context. So I don't feel compelled every time that I condemn the Israelis to give lip service to the Israeli claims. Everyone knows what those claims are. But the reason why Hamas is in civilian areas is because there is no such thing as a non-civilian area in Gaza. Gaza is a very densely packed country where 2.2 million people are squeezed into this tiny little strip of land. There's no battlefields or military installations where Hamas can go and fight. It's just like the Taliban. They're part of the Afghan people. Hamas is integrated into the Palestinian population. And the fact that Israel says we want to go kill Hamas does not mean that Israel is then liberated from the laws of war, that they can go and collectively punish populations, that they can go and kill tens of thousands of women and children, which is what composes 70% of the people that Israel has killed, that they can destroy the ability of 2.2 million people to feed itself by blockading food and water. None of this context justifies any of that. And this context is something I talk about all the time. It doesn't mean that every single time I mention Israel and Palestine. And tonight, the only thing I actually mentioned was the question of whether the United States should fund and finance and arm Israel and its military and its wars. Why does that require context of October 7th and Hamas? The question of whether or not the United States should be financing the Israeli military and the Israeli wars while millions of Israelis have a higher standard of living than millions of Americans doesn't matter at all in terms of this context of who's right and wrong. That's just a point of why is this the United States' war to finance and arm? So that was the only thing I talked about tonight. And actually, it was even narrower than that. It was about Ben Shapiro's support for the United States' posture in Israel aligning with the posture of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden and the establishment wing of the Republican Party. I don't think that context matters at all in terms of the view that I was expressing. The next part of this is another buzzword that's fallen away, provoked. The U.S. NATO clearly provoked the Russians in Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine in particular, but I don't hear much of any mention of Hamas provoking the onslaught that is taking place. If you are somebody who believes that the U.S. and NATO provoked the Russians in Ukraine, why isn't the context that Israel provoked Hamas to attack on October 7th by doing all the things that I just got done outlining? I mean, if you're an American citizen, you were in the United States, and a foreign military came to the United States and blockaded the United States, bombed all of our airports, murdered anyone who tried to leave by sea, closed off our borders, periodically bombed us, and denied our statehood, presumably there'd be a lot of Americans, I hope I would be one of them, who would fight back against the foreign army doing that. And I would say that if I fought back against that foreign army, that I was provoked by that foreign army that did that to the land where I was living. So if you want to talk about provocation, I wouldn't say that the Israelis were provoked by Hamas on October 7th. I don't think that a Hamas attack that results in, say, 600 Israeli civilians justifies the complete destruction of civilian life in Gaza. 70% of buildings destroyed, 95% of the internal population displaced, the entire healthcare system and sewage system of Gaza permanently destroyed. No, I don't think that the day of October 7th is anything close to a provocation for what has followed. And if you see things through this lens of provocation, then I think you would say that it was the Israelis that provoked the Hamas attack. Last part here, if you're a River to the Sea ideologue or religious exterminationist, of course there will be talk of resistance and Finkelstein's glory is breaking out and the killing will continue. At a minimum, release the damn hostages. There will at least be a pause, but not even a mention or a hint that this is something that needs to happen because it is politically possible for the IDF to stand down. Honestly, of all the arguments that people make in this whole context, most of which has been very well rehearsed, everyone knows what the answer is to everyone's argument. The thing that makes the least amount of sense to me is the idea that the destruction of Gaza is justified by the fact that there are Israeli hostages still in Gaza. If you want to save the hostages, the last thing you would do is bomb the entire area of land where the hostages are. And in fact, a lot of hostages have been killed by Israeli bombing. The Israeli government itself admits that. Or the last thing you would want to do is starve the place where those hostages are as well. Obviously, people who are hostages have come out and said that they were deprived of food, that they didn't have anywhere near a diet of subsistence, but they were eating the same as their captors. There's just no food in Gaza either. Obviously, I think that taking up hostages is unjustified. I've talked about that before. I've talked about why October 7th is justified. But if you don't look at it in the overall context of what has been happening between Israel and Gaza, then I think there's no way that you can understand the actual context and to say, well, I think that Hamas should just surrender. I mean, you can say that in every war. Every war will end if one side just surrenders. But at some point, people are going to fight back if they feel like they are being attacked and being mistreated. And I think that is what most Palestinians feel. And at this point, tribal lines have been drawn. Human beings are very tribal. There are Jews all over the world that identify with Israel, that want as many Palestinians killed as possible. There are a lot of Palestinians who want as many Jews killed as possible. And when you unleash these kind of tribal hatreds, these entrenched tribal hatreds, I agree, it's very difficult to end the war. But principally as an American, the question I always have is, why is it the United States and its role to keep this war going, to fund this war, to give Israel the arms, to pay for the Israeli military? How is it that that is something that American citizens should be responsible to do? And I don't think any of this context affects that calculation in any way. But certainly all of these things are things we've been over so many times over the last 5 months. I don't think it's reasonable to say that every time I even mention the question of policy toward Israel, even in the context of just comparing the two parties and how they're similar on it, or questioning why the Americans should pay for it, that I have to go through this entire context every single time. I think we're 5 months into a war. People understand everyone's views on the context very well. And I think you have to look at, not every time I mention it, but the overall 5 months of discussion and reporting that we've done to see the extent to which we've addressed all that. The clip you just watched is from the live after show we do on Locals, exclusively for our local subscribers. The live after show airs every Tuesday and Thursday nights immediately following our live system update show on Rumble, which is freely available to everyone. To join our Locals community, simply click the join button under each video on our Rumble page or at the link below. That not only entitles you to exclusive access to our after show, where we take your questions, respond to your critiques and feedback, and hear suggestions for issues we should cover and people we should interview, but also to the transcripts for each show that we produce, as well as the exclusive written content we publish there. Enjoy.